And you're going to tell us about how it's possible to think about user experience of artificial intelligence in games. And I really look forward to hearing your talk. So please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. So my name is Henrik Warpefelt. I am, like Miriam said, an assistant professor at the Department of Software Engineering and Game Development at the College of Computing and Software Engineering. Yes, I have to say this, at Kennesaw State University in Atlanta, Georgia. And this will be a talk about the user experience of artificial intelligence in games. So Miriam already spoiled this slide a little bit, but so I was just a little bit about me. I did my education at DSV, my PhD and my master's. So I did AI, UX of AI basically, but I did NPCs for my PhD, and then I had a master's in software engineering from DSV. In terms of, and I did my PhD with Harker Verhagen, who you may be familiar with. I don't know if they've met him, Miriam.
I'm not sure.
Yes. Well, anyway, so he was my supervisor. He's still at DSV. So in terms of research, I obviously do the user UX of AI stuff, where I sort of look at how user experience is sort of interacts with AI in games. And this is sort of part of a larger investigative track of trying to find some kind of good design practices for novel technologies. Because right now AI is kind of the novel technology that we have for games. And a lot of user experience ties into making game design, right? Because essentially when we're designing games, we are designing experiences. So I'm looking at this experience thing in terms of game design, but also through the lens of traditional UX stuff. And essentially, I'm trying to, in the end of this, hopefully by the end of my career kind of thing, have some kind of formalization of game design where I've been able to present a number of good design practices for novel technologies as they appear, which right now is AI, which is where I started, but I can foresee this going somewhere else in the future. So with that little intro, my narcissistic intro of myself completed, let's launch into a talk. So this is a question I'd like to lead with. So why was No Man's Sky a flop, right? Because a lot of what when they were hyping it up, I mean, one of the main developers did talk shows and stuff, and they kind of set high expectations for us, right? That's supposed to be the game, the real cool selling, like this is the game that will make game AI put it at the forefront, make it one of the truly amazing things that we can do, and we can use technology to solve, right? As it turns out, this is what we got. So what they sold us maybe didn't really match the reality. So I'm going to mostly cage this, or sort of wrap this talk up in this question, like, why was No Man's Sky a flop? Because it's obvious that it's about what the expectations versus reality, but the nuance of how those expectations and how that reality clashed are kind of the key interest here for UX of AI. And I'm very fortunate to their detriment. I am fortunate that this game did flop so badly, at least it didn't do very well, because that gives me a perfect example to use when I talk about my research. We should also note that what I'm talking about here is what makes a game good, right? The thing is, if trying to understand what makes a game good or even okay is basically walking straight into the essence of this meme. It is really difficult. And we see this in the industry, right? No Man's Sky flopped, but we also see multiple games from series that have been going on forever that just don't take off or get terrible reviews because they made some tiny little change that seemed good in testing, but just didn't work out, right? So understanding what makes a game good, which is then central to the experience of this game, is just difficult. So what I'm trying to get at here is sort of that instead of finding one thing that makes stuff good, we maybe need some kind of almost Lemus function type deal that we're sort of slowly approaching good for a game, right? So we essentially need some kind of framework to help us deconstruct what this gaming experience is. And we are fortunate that game studies, the field of game studies, has given us a plethora of different facets that we can use to understand a game, right? The thing is that we also have a plethora of facets in which we can understand a game, and integrating these into a model is super difficult. It's really hard to achieve like this model that will help us understand something, right? Because we have so many factors that go into this explanation. Many of them are under-explained to the point where we can't really just fit them onto a game and go like, yes, it's bad because of this, right? So when I've done research here, Björn Stoltz, one of the people at DSV2, and I have found that basically there's some kind of secret sauce reasoning here. And that seems to be audience specific. So depending on who you're targeting and who you want to sell this game to, there's a different secret sauce. Like some people happen to like ketchup. Some people want that weird hamburger dressing that we have in Sweden. Some people want sriracha, but most people don't want all of them. And there's really, in the same way, probably no grand unified model of gaming experience, at least not now. Maybe at the end of my career, there will be one. But I don't think we have one yet because it's such a complex problem to describe. So what I'm trying to do is sort of approach this idea of game designing good through the metaphor of narrative. Basically, I'm trying to figure out what the story that the game is telling us is actually. So this has been extensive research for games by game studies people. So there's a lot to draw on here, and there's a lot of things that we can use to start approaching this good idea, right? Because we start looking at this story and the narrative that the game is telling us. And the game is telling us a story, right? Because if only on the surface, we have partially stuff like environmental narratives. We walk through a game world and we see stuff, right? We see that we can interact with and stuff we can process somehow. So we know if we're in a game from the American Revolution or from a Viking era or something, like just partially because where it's set, right? And of course, there's also usually in most games, at least most bigger games now, a story. I mean, we also have the example of Tetris, which sort of has a narrative in itself. We're going to get to that in a little bit, but not necessarily a story that's being told by the game, right? So it's not the epic of the falling block. It's more of a number of blocks came in sequence, right? So as I mentioned, a lot of this stuff has been processed by game studies, and there are essentially two really relevant frameworks here that we sort of need to be aware of. Jenkins in 2005, and I think Miriam's going to cringe a little bit because this is really old by now, but it's still relevant for the argument here. Jenkins talked about embedded and emergent narratives. So the embedded narratives are the stuff that's basically already placed in the game. And the emergent narrative is stuff that arises as you play the game. So the specific quest texts are embedded narrative, whereas the order by which someone would do the quests would be emergent narrative, or this starts to happen in between. If someone encounters a dragon out in the wild or whatever. Kalea developed this a little bit further, where he talks about predefined narrative and alter biography. So the predefined narrative is essentially, with some nuanced differences that don't really matter for this argument, the same as the embedded narrative. It's the narrative that's written into the game. The alter biography, however, is where this gets interesting, because this is the sort of the key thing that enables us to talk about user experience. The alter biography is the story of how I played the game from my perspective. So it's the biography I write of my time in the game. So it's not necessarily that it's an emergent narrative, but it's also not necessarily the order by which someone made the quests or did the quests, as it is the order by which I did the quests. Like I went to the town, I talked to the innkeeper, I went and fought the rats, I went back and got some cheese as a reward, right? Instead of a third person here. So it's all about the user's experience as they were experiencing the narrative. And that's an interesting idea for us if we're looking at user experience, right? Because now we're inherently looking at a narrative-full story. Now, there's also a ton of ways that this stuff is told in games, and there's something that I like to call micro-level storytelling, and I've kind of stolen half of this from Jenkins because he's talked a little bit about it too, but basically, a game is made up of a ton of tiny little narratives, right? That all together form this alter biography. And you can keep deconstructing this to the level of little details in the environment. For example, in lexical storytelling, which Fernandez Vara introduced in 2011. If you've ever been to a Disney theme park, if you haven't, you really should go once the pandemic is over, because it's a wonderful experience. But Disney is where Fernandez Vara got this idea of lexical storytelling from. In their parks, they do these wonderful sort of environmental and storytelling of, you get a narrative of where you are. If you go to, for example, Epcot, you enter into the English village and it looks like an English village. And then you see across this lagoon, and I mean, you're in Florida and it's baking, but you see across this lagoon, if you look further, you can see a Norse stave church in the Norway pavilion further on. So you get these kind of little things that are called wieners into theme park design, and also it's been transferred into environmental design, where people, there are sort of bigger set pieces that call to an adventure. So for this Norway pavilion has a big stave church that you can see from far away. You go like, oh, there's Norway. So that becomes sort of a point of navigation for you, but also maybe somewhere you want to go because it kind of calls you to it. And similar in the game, you'll maybe see the big starship or the castle that you have to go to, right? And that inherently guides you towards an experience that the developer wants you to have. It makes it seem like, even though maybe you're technically, if you look at how a level works, you're technically running through some kind of corridor, but you're actually exploring this open world game. It makes you feel like you're in an open world and you're just exploring some hidden valleys or something. Or maybe it's an entirely open world like Skyrim, but you see this castle on a hill further away, and that's where you want to go, right? You just follow the road and then you get to the castle. That's a very designed experience, and you can veer off, but you're being incentivized not to. So by providing us with this story, they sort of guide our entire experience and how we write our autobiography to create this game's experience. This interacts with user experience because the user experience is inherently a narrative exercise, because narratives are how we fundamentally understand user experience, right? If you just look at the techniques that we use to develop this stuff, we have user stories, we have scenarios, we have personas. If you're not familiar, user stories and scenarios are little snippets of story that we use, how someone would use a system or how someone would perform tasks in a system. And personas are essentially instantiations of someone that we think a potential user for our system. And conversely, then if we start looking at this from the game's perspective, we have this already, right? Because our game is inherently an experiential thing with a story, if nothing else, an autobiography, which is inherently a big scenario for how we would use this game. And then, of course, to have this scenario, we have a persona or the player. So inherently, our user experience is a narrative. And that's why it ties in so heavily with the narrative of the game. Not necessarily the predefined narrative, but also the autobiography and the emergent narrative, which are sort of the bigger things that we actually remember, right? We don't really remember the specific plot of Mass Effect, maybe, but maybe we remember that one series of really cool interactions we had, and we went on a great adventure. Now, the thing is, we talked about environmental storytelling, but we do derive significance from details in artifacts too. Because when we see something in an artifact, we start typing what it is and how we can use it. Norman calls these signifiers, and signifiers sort of signal something called affordances, which is how we can use something abstracted. I've taken these and run with them a little bit and turned them into something called indicators, which is not only the signifiers for an action, so for affordance with an object, but also tie into something by Cardona Rivera called narrative affordances, which is how you can control your own narrative. See where this ties back to narrative is where I control my own experience now. So not only can I can change the physical world in the game, or the virtual physical world in the game, by using affordances for objects, but I can also use affordances for the narrative to change by the direct trajectory of my story. And then we have these indicators that also help us build up the background and font of this story, right? So together, this clump concept helps us convey something about the entirety of the game, but also operates on many different levels for the user to help them guide themselves through the environment, help them guide them to an experience, help them understand what they can do. And these things, although conceptually separate, are inseparable when you're signing for them, because all of them carry these three levels of meaning at the same time. And the thing about these details is that they convey something called character. Now, character is essentially how we understand what something is. This is a theory from when usability transitioned to UX in the late 90s and early 2000s. This is sort of one of the foundational ideas for that. And it's how we understand what something is. So how we understand the difference between a sports car and a van or a family saloon car, right? And we have all of us carry with us a huge repertoire of character. If you look at your computer that you're sitting at right now, you can probably identify what kind of computer it is, if it's a gaming laptop or a professional thin and light laptop or even a desktop, right? And you have a number of criteria that you evaluate this by. If it's a thin and light, it's probably lighter. I mean, it comes from the name, right? Lighter. If it's a professional looking device, it maybe isn't as garish as maybe with all the colored lighting and stuff, as a gaming laptop would be. And so we have these repertoires of characters, they're called by Jan Stolteman, which help us identify what kind of object we're looking at. So let's use an example for this. I would like to see in chat how many people are familiar with the DeLorean of. I always want to know how this lands because it's starting to become an outdated reference to do a DeLorean. Because I don't know if people have seen Back to the Future anymore. But this it looks like a sports car, right? The thing with the DeLorean is it wasn't very powerful. It only had 130 horsepower and a fairly low amount of torque, right? And you look at the power to weight ratio, it's 0.105. The power to torque to weight ratio is 0.168. Sorry. So this is a 1983 DeLorean. This profoundly is not a sports car, right? This is a family sedan. And yet it's more powerful. If you look at the DeLorean, the Volvo is in all characteristics more powerful. But we wouldn't type this as a sports car. But if you ask someone what the key characteristic of a sports car is, oh, it's fast. Right? That's what a sports car does. It goes fast, right? So there are some other ideas for a sports car that we use. It's probably that the DeLorean is low, sleek, and low to the ground, right? And that it's got that top line that makes it look fast. This looks like a box with a box on it on wheels. It doesn't look. It's basically a brick hurtling through the air. So we kind of need to have some kind of idea for what a sports car is that isn't this Volvo, but also is this DeLorean, and that's the character. So the character of a sports car would be maybe a luxury interior. I don't really remember if the DeLorean had one. Some kind of low and sleek design, aerodynamic, maybe. Both of these are kind of boxy because that's the design of the 1980s. But still, they are very different cars, right? So we have in ourselves, we instantly know that this is a sports car, this isn't, even though the second one is more faster, right? That's a weird, interesting fact that the Volvo 244 Turbo is faster than the DeLorean. But the thing is also that when we start looking at these things, that's a good example for Swedes because all of us have seen a 244, right? There's some kind of cultural inherent character. So character is something that we read into something, and from our culture, where we come from, our background, if we belong to a subculture or if you move to another country or stuff, we have a different set of culture. I know I recently moved to Atlanta, which is a very different place than Stockholm, where I'm from, which has a different character for the streetscape than Stockholm. So I have had to relearn what are the signifiers for a bad area, what are the signifiers for a good area, and what signifies that area in between where it's not fantastic, it's not terrible, but I had to relearn those. And if you've ever been to another country, or if you've ever moved to another country, you'll know that you have to relearn a lot of these things so you can sort of act effectively, right? You have to relearn the traffic patterns, all that stuff. But when we come into a situation, we do carry with us an existing repertoire of character. So my existing Swedish cityscape repertoire of character, this culture inherent to me as a Swede, doesn't really work here. The thing is that you can also play on this with something called Simulacratude. So essentially a simulacrum, which is a Baudrillard, and I'm butchering that name. I'm sorry to any French-speaking people. A Baudrillardian concept. It's essentially a copy without an original. The example that's usually used for this is Main Street USA at Disneyland, which is sort of the virtual American street that sort of looks like the main street of a small American town, but there's no copy. This is not a copy of anything. It's just made to look like that. And in games, we see a lot of this. In GTA 5, for example, the entire city is a simulacrum of Los Angeles. So it's not actually Los Angeles, but it just looks a lot like Los Angeles. And Simulacratude is the nature of being a simulacrum. I have an example of this. On the left here is an American town, and on the right is a Bavarian town. The left side here is called Helen. It's here in Georgia. It's up in the mountains. The history of Helen is that fun fact, the first gold rush was not in California, but actually in the Georgia mountains. And tons of these little mountain towns popped up where they did a lot of gold digging. Unfortunately, when the gold runs out, of course, being very good at Minecraft, and not the game, but the actual profession, a lot of Germans moved to Georgia mountains, which is why we still have a fairly strong German presence up there, or sort of German heritage presence up there to this day. But when the gold ran out, these people needed something to sustain themselves, right? Because if you can't mine gold and you're a gold miner, then you're in a slight bit of difficulty, let's put it that way. So what they did was they reshaped Helen, which already kind of had a little German vibe to it because there were so many Germans living there. They reshaped it into a tourist town. So now it looks like a copy, essentially a copy of a generic Bavarian town, although filtered through an American lens. And it looks so much like a German town that when my girlfriend, who's from Florida but lives here in Atlanta, hadn't been to the Alps before, we went to the Alps a couple of years back. She was like, "This place looks like Helen." That was her interpretation, because that's the cultural connotation she's carried, because she'd been to Helen before. And when I then went to Helen a year or so later, after we'd been to the Alps, I was like, "Yeah, this does look like the Alps." It's a weird American interpretation of the Alps, but it's still the Alps. So this kind of repertoire of character we had from, because I'd been to the Alps before. So for me, seeing the Alps, the Alpine villages like Oberammergau on the right here first, and then seeing Helen made me, of course, think about Helen, or think about the Alps when I saw Helen. Where someone who's first encountered Helen then saw the Alps will think, "Oh, the Alpine villages look a lot like Helen." So there's this connotation that we've sort of transferred. We created a simulacrum of a German Alpine, or they have a German Alpine village in the North Georgia mountains, which are very different mountains, but still around there. And it kind of works. It's interpreted if you go, if you've moved to Sweden from somewhere else and you're eating your home cuisine in Sweden, it's probably going to be a little weird, because it's probably a simulacrum made with local ingredients and stuff of what you're used to from home. And same thing, if you find, as a Swede, you find Swedish food somewhere that isn't IKEA, it's probably not going to be exactly the same if you make it yourself, because you don't really have the same tools and same ingredients and stuff. So always be a little bit of a simulacrum of what you're actually trying to make, even though it is maybe authentic Swedish food made by a Swede. So this whole idea of culturally inherent character is something we carry into our evaluation. And what the interesting thing about Helen and Oberammergau here in the example is that there's an intended versus an apparent product character. So Hassan Saul talked about this. When you design something, you create a product that's intended to look a certain way, but when then ends up in the hands of users, they're going to take that product and go like, "Oh, this is what it is," and it may be something completely different from what you intended. This has been transferred to games by Björn Stroll, who's also at DSV. And this intended character sort of forms what the designer thought they were making, and the apparent character forms what you as the user are seeing and are evaluating from this. I've spun this further, and also they're pretty much never the same. I've spun this further a little bit into something called the indicator model, where I use these indicators I talked about before, and I bastardized Hassan Saul's theory. Basically, we start looking at a bunch of different features, so the designer creates an intended experience that then decomposes into a bunch of indicators in essence. This whole heap of indicators are then taken up by the player. It's filtered through their situation and interpreted, and then they create an experience. The thing is, there's a situation here, if you're not familiar with the concept, it's basically when something's played, what kind of experience the player comes in with, but also their expectations going in, right? So when we go into these situations, gaming situations, like we mentioned before, we bring with us a repertoire of character. We get set expectations somehow from, say, the guy going on a talk show, telling us how wonderful his game's going to be. And if you look at research from, say, Kulteman Stenros, this expectation sort of starts being set as early as when you see the first word of the game. So the first name of the title, No Man's Sky, No Man's, etc. Like, that's going to set some expectations for you. And then you see the box art and go like, "Whoa, what's this?" So you start conceptualizing what kind of game this would be. And that starts setting expectations on what you would want from this experience, right? And that's going to influence how you become situated in relation to the game and how your interpretation happens, your expected experience. And that's then going to result in a different player experience, which is why there's always a mismatch between the intended product character and the apparent product character of anything, but especially of games, because it's such a complex thing. I'm going to spend the next couple of slides kind of ruining Marvel's shows a little bit. I'm not going to, there won't be any big spoilers, but I'm going to show you some things that what we think they are and what they actually are. So if you've seen WandaVision, this is the Sentient Weapon Observation Response Division, or SWORD, because of course they have to have a cool acronym. This is their headquarters, right? Looks like a really cool sci-fi space. Where this is a sci-fi space where someone would, like, where people who do sci-fi stuff work. They work for this SWORD headquarters, right? Where there's a sci-fi space. Yeah, that's the Georgia World Congress Center here in Atlanta. So this is space that actually exists. I mean, it's cool architecture, and they've done some CG to make it cool. I mean, they've replaced the gifts and sundries thing and the information desk. Like, they removed some stuff of that. They added a little desk under somewhere, and they added a statue and made it look. They styled the space up, but fundamentally, it is the same space, right? So what they've done here is they've taken this existing space, which we have expectation. They've sort of looked at what the expectations are for the headquarters of SWORD, right? This mysterious government organization. And they're like, okay, there's sci-fi. We need a sci-fi space. Here's a sci-fi space because someone scattered that where location scats. Similarly, this is the TVA headquarters from Loki. And incidentally, this ended up being 2 headquarters from Marvel series, which is this. Well, I don't want to spoil it actually, but it's a big organization in the Loki series, and they have this big headquarters with a lot of rows. And this looks like it's made fully CG, right? No, it's the Marriott in Atlanta. That's a hotel. Really cool architecture, right? And this place looks super cool. But this is where you can go for Dragon Con every year. What's a couple weeks back, but not recommended during the pandemic, of course. So we have this like sci-fi looking hotel space. Of course, we use that as our sci-fi organization thing. And they only really added a couple of staircases and a couple of statues to this to make it look like a weird sci-fi space that sort of exists in an impossible way, whereas we humans can create pretty cool architecture already. And this carries on. This is a scene from Falcon the Winter Soldier, where they're in Madripoor, and there's this tunnel. Well, this is Clark Street Tunnel. If I want to go to downtown Atlanta, I bike or drive through this every day. If I wanted to go to downtown Atlanta, it basically looks like this. All they've added is a couple of people on motorcycles. This is from Falcon the Winter Soldier. So they take these. We take this idea of Madripoor in Falcon the Winter Soldier, which is this sort of freebooting, free city, and they find a space that looks like it, and our expectation set stuff. This is Pullman Yard. It's about 1 kilometer from where I'm sitting at this very moment. It's an old disused train yard where they're currently doing a Van Gogh exhibition, right? And we see Captain America running here in the shot. Essentially, what they've taken here is in a disused rail yard. Went like, oh, this looks cool. We can make this represent. I think they're in Germany in this scene or something, and have that be a train station, right? That's an old disused train station where the bad guys would be hiding, maybe. So we have all these little expectations on things that people carry with them, and we'll forgive a lot of stuff. I mean, they've added some CG background here, but a lot of this is just finding a good location and then reusing it based on the expectations of the user. Right. Now, I've been rambling for a long time about user experience, but what does this have to do with AI? Well, a lot of what makes AI work in games is that users accept that AI does work, right? So we have some kind of behavior, which is what I did before, the NPC behavior stuff, but also the appearance of things. So the generated artifacts, how they can interact with them. So which kind of affordances do these provide, both for narrative and for in general interaction, right? But also the kind of outputs that we produce. If this is a generator for trees, we probably want a tree like trees, right? That looks like we expect from trees. And the sort of how we can interact and react get reactions from this in AI to certain stimulus. Essentially, what makes AI work in games is the character of AI, the character of the AI. So the kind of character that we've told the user is there and the character it's actually exhibiting. And that creates the user experience of AI in games. So that's why I've been rambling about this for so long, because it's, that's the kind of thing we need to think about if we want to evaluate how AI actually achieves user acceptance. Now, we should note here that when I usually talk about AI in games, I have this slide just because I think it's a point that needs to be made, but I think most students in this course will understand it already. The default layman's association seems to be not NPCs, and that's where I started with doing research on AI, right? But the thing is that AI is absolutely everywhere, and I think Miriam's already told you about this, where we have sort of NPC behavior, and they control the story like they would in, say, Vermintide or Left 4 Dead. They generate assets like we have SpeedTree, which is arguably one of the most successful generators ever in terms of game content, right? And we also do processing of player data with AI to understand better if we need to do dynamic difficulty adjustment in situation, or if we need to do offline processing of like how many, what kind of players play our game, right? Maybe we make some machine learning model to predict what kind of content we would need to add to our game, or in terms of our levels. The people who are working for this for Candy Crush, for example. But we also have, like, assets are also made both online and offline. Maybe we generate them on the fly with, say, the pedestrians in GTA, where they sort of just appear and they seem fairly believable, right? Or we do generate stuff offline where we may generate entire terrain for a map using AI to make it be a reasonable terrain instead of handcrafting it. What I'm trying to get at here is essentially that AI is not only creating the game, but they're also co-creating the game with us, because we're using AI stuff in our creation process, but also as we're playing the game. And since we're interacting with AI during the entire gaming process, they're kind of co-creating the gaming experience with us, right? Because the NPC behavior and the story control, I mean, that's literally controlling our experience, the experience that we have. So we're essentially having this interactive dialogue with an AI that we may be mediated through story or through we perform certain actions and they provide certain responses. So we need to maybe think about AI as sort of a co-creator and a partner, rather than a thing that just does something, a machine that just spits something out. All right, so we also have a bunch of artifacts that are created by AI in games. And when we're looking at these AI designed artifacts, we need to have some kind of criteria for how we should evaluate them. The ones that I've found based on my research and the research of others is that we need to look at novelty, we need to be consistent, we need to be coherent. Now, the last two are the easiest ones. Essentially, if you're consistent with what's being promised, so the expectations, and consistent with what's previously been shown, and you're coherent with what's being shown, so the actual output is coherent, then you will avoid breaking the illusion of the game and keeping the level of immersion running. Because that's the fundamental level. Don't do something super unexpected. The thing is, though, novelty is super important. And tomorrow, I think you're going to have Kate Compton here talking, and she has produced a theory about novelty where we talk about perceptual uniqueness and perceptual differentiation. Perceptual uniqueness is that we can perceive that an object is unique. Perceptual differentiation is that we can perceive that objects are different. And the reason systems like SpeedTree, for example, work so well is that they completely only rely on perceptual differentiation, because it's a bunch of trees. And most people, unless they're biologists specialized in trees, are not going to go, that tree looks a little bit weird if it's a little bit off, because we have this kind of blurred perception of trees. It's just a forest, right? I mean, it's even the Swedish saying that you can't see the forest for all the trees, right? Whereas if we want something perceptually unique, maybe that is not at the moment something we would necessarily want to generate with AI. So maybe the point of AI generation should be to work on perceptual differentiation rather than perceptual uniqueness. That's my big selling point for this talk. Kate has the example of 10,000 bowls of oatmeal, and I like this example. For using a generator, it's super easy to create 10,000 different bowls of oatmeal that are subtly different. Like we varied the amount of salt by a microgram. These are not really perceptually unique, and they're not perceptually different, right? We can create 10,000 versions of perceptually different oatmeal, and that'll be all right because it'll exist, but I don't really want to subsist off just oatmeal, 10,000 very different bowls of oatmeal where I've varied salt, I've added some other spice or something, right? So we can't only have perceptual differentiation, we also need to have perceptual uniqueness, right? So why was No Man's Sky a flop? Returning to the question. Well, No Man's Sky basically failed at perceptual uniqueness. They had some perceptual differentiation. We could tell that stuff was different, but we could never really find anything unique except for this fish doing something uniquely stupid. We also had a bunch of bugs, but disregarding that, the fundamental idea of the game kind of didn't work because they couldn't create these unique experiences they were promising. And that led the expectations to be, well, shattered, basically. The expectations, you had very high expectations for the game and they just didn't deliver on that. But the mechanism by which they did that was not being able to provide content that is unique enough for people to feel that it's worth visiting all these quintillion worlds, right? So I'm getting to the point here. I think, Miriam, I'm maybe running a little short on time. I'm good, all right. So essentially, what I'm advocating is a better way of generating experiences in games. As we've seen, games are full of indicators, right? And these are the building blocks of the characters and the affordances and all that we have in the game. And a generative game experience is no different. In fact, we maybe want to lean a little bit more into that, because the thing is that programmatic generation really lends itself to formalized ways of thinking about games. An example of this is Prop. Now, I know Miriam is going to cringe when I mention Vladimir Prop here. He is sort of the thing that you get to. What Vladimir Prop did was he created a morphology of the Russian folktales. Basically, he had a grammar and a language to describe a bunch of folktales, which worked really well, and it's really good research for being from I think 1968, even when it was translated to English. It's from the 20s or something. So it's pretty old research by now, but what it let him do was create a grammar that we could describe all the Russian folktales, and then from that create new folktales. The thing is that he pretty much always runs into the problem of perceptual differentiation and perceptual uniqueness here, right? Because he can create 1,000 stories of different heroes doing different things and murdering wolves in various ways, etc. But he doesn't really create an engaging story from these blocks. What's needed here is some kind of X factor or secret sauce that makes these stories interesting. So if we reason just in terms of these indicators that we see, we're not really going to get the whole story of the folktale or of the game, right? So instead, we can mix in something, say, Murray's idea of the bardic narrative. So we're actually using human creativity to fill in the blanks between these indicators. And that's sort of what this morphology that Prop created requires. So if you let the player's imagination fill in the blanks for a lot of what you're generating, you could probably get away with a lot more than you would if you're just creating something that is very high definition and sort of doesn't leave a lot of room for exploration of the actual consumer of the product, right? So who's doing this right? Well, SpeedTree, because it's arguably the most successful game AI system ever, because it's in every game. If you've played a game or seen a Hollywood movie lately that has foliage in it, it's probably made with SpeedTree. So it's probably the most successful thing. If you haven't played RimWorld, it's a space colony survival game. You really need to play it if you're studying the experience of AI. It is fantastic. If you want to check out the generative design in Minecraft competition, they have some really cool things. For example, these are computer generated by, again, generators. And this is something Christoph Salich et al. Are running for the Minecraft competition. And these are made by generators. They're not in any way made by humans. I mean, the basic assets may be designed by humans, but they're placed in a world where they actually matter. And these things come off as being fairly believable, even though they're just made by computers, right? So we have, because of how Minecraft and RimWorld, because this is what RimWorld looks like, we have this low, very constrained set of design parameters. there's not a lot that can go wrong, right? So the representation we have makes us expect less. This is why this works, right? And that makes us also, that controls the player experience. It makes it easier for us as players to accept some of the maybe shortcomings, that maybe this representation makes it easier for us to accept that some of the weirdly represented shortcomings are just, oh, we can't just tell the difference here, right? That could be the problem that we're currently facing. So what needs to be explored? Well, the main research question that I think is of core value here is, how do we enable designers to do more with AI while maintaining an acceptable level of quality, right? Because right now AI is the hot thing. It's something we pretty much want to work with, because it's going to have a democratization effect on game design and stuff like, because people who let smaller studios do more with less, basically, and also maybe stop some of the problems that we have with the games industry, where every project is now a high risk project. So to actually be able to answer that question, we need to understand what the key performance indicators are for generative artifacts, and in terms of believability and user acceptance, so what the secret sauce is. And also how we can reduce the complexity of generative artifacts, because right now we're kind of plagued by this being really complex and really costly. So how do we maintain believability and the novelty and consistency and everything while still reducing it? So what's the minimum viable product in each case? That's sort of the two of the main questions that we need to answer. And that is the end of my talk. If anyone wants to stop the recording.
Wow, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was really elegant, the talk,
Thank
and
you.
thought-provoking. I have lots of questions, but what we can do now is really, like, if you have questions, write them in the chat, and I will tell Henrik.
Thank you.
But what they're writing here is, thank you, awesome talk, what she said, and this is really useful for us as designers. And
thank you. Yes, I actually have the chat up.
Oh.
I would like to request just 3 minutes, and then I'll be right back.
Yeah, let's do some questions.
Right.
So something that we have been discussing here in the short break that we had was the notion of character that you're bringing forth. It's something that we have been discussing during the course, like, because we have been building ontologies using OWL as the basis for whatever is built in the project. But then it's more like looking at the character of the thing that you are going to build, while you're kind of skewing it around, looking at the character that it really expresses, which is, I think, is a very nice way of putting it, and then tying that together to the perceptual uniqueness. So a question like this perceptual uniqueness, how did you come up with this reasoning, and how do you tie it in to this model of yours, the indicator model?
So I should mention that I did not come up with perceptual uniqueness. Kate Compton did.
Oh, right. Okay, so that's Kate. Right. Okay.
But basically, so Kate wrote this. It's actually a blog post that Kate wrote called "So You Want to Build a Generator," which is about building generators. And it's a shame that she never turned that into a paper, because she really should. And I think we've both told her that a couple of times by now. But essentially, the idea of perceptual uniqueness and perceptual differentiation stems from all these little details in the thing, right? So and that's also what character stems from. So essentially, perceptual uniqueness and perceptual differentiation are essentially what kind of character you're representing, and how that character interplays with all the other similar pieces of the same character you've seen in the game, right? And essentially, by getting to perceptual uniqueness, you have a vastly different, or maybe not vastly, but a different character than you would for something that's very similar, just perceptually differentiatable. If we look at sports cars, for example, the DeLorean has a very unique look. It's perceptually very unique. But if you look at a lot of these very $1 million sports car looking things, they kind of look the same, because they end up, now they're all designed in wind tunnels and stuff. So they have almost a cookie cutter look to them. Like if you look at a Corvette or a McLaren or whatever, that there are expensive cars, but they're not really that unique, right? They end up being dime a dozen, even though they're supposed to be a unique statement piece, which is kind of funny. I think there's a reference or comment here to be made about teenagers and how they dress, and they all try to be unique, but they end up looking the same.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That's kind of it, right? So they try to achieve perceptual uniqueness, but they only achieve perceptual differentiation at best.
So so another thing that you had a slide here about things that you think should be kind of applied in the future.
What are, back up a little bit.
Yeah, do that. And because the question for you is, out of these three things, where are you going to put your focus?
So where I'm putting my focus right now at this, not this very moment, but this later today actually, is the last question here. I'm trying to figure out what the minimum viable narrative is in a game and how that ties into presentation. So right now I have the prototype I'm working on is basically we have these simple, if you play Caves of Cud, it's a text-based kind of like NetHack style, almost ASCII art. It is actually ASCII art game, where you encounter things in the world where, like, in 1927, Bob went to France, stuff like that. So you build the Gospel of Bob, basically. That's what they would call it. And I'm taking that idea and reducing it even further to just a simple little dungeon crawl that's text-based, where all you can do is go in and look around and see if that creates some kind of meaningful gaming experience. And the idea is to scale that up and try to do a 2D game with the same kind of narrative, and a 3D game with the same kind of narrative, and then maybe add game elements. So if we have a 2D game, maybe we do a Zelda type deal. We have to fight some slimes in a dungeon or whatever. And the idea here is to see, where is this? It seems like the complexity of narrative and the complexity of the game have to roughly match each other in some way. So what's the biggest delta we can have? And what is the minimum viable for both of them? And for, say, for a 2D game, what's the minimum viable generative narrative we can have and still have it be a believable and interesting experience?
So if I'm understanding you right, then you're going to kind of look at Fernandez Vara's kind of thing of indexical storytelling, when you have these micro bits. Will you also look at how many micro bits you need to combine in order to?
So I'm unsure that there's a how many. I think maybe there's a qualitative assessment of that so far. I think you maybe, if even just with I have a book chapter coming out later in November where I have a three stanza story. Say, let's sort of make one up to exemplify this, right? Torg the Barbarian was found in the woods an orphan. Torg the Barbarian defeated the dragon of Helmsford. Torg the Barbarian became mayor of Helmsford. So now we have like three little stanzas, and it still tells us a story of Torg the Barbarian, right? So we have some notion of who Torg the Barbarian is. But what we really know about Torg is that he was an orphan, he somehow defeated a dragon, and he became mayor of the town. Now, as a human, we will infer that Torg is maybe some kind of great warrior, and he defeated the dragon through martial force, right? And that the people of Helmsford elected him to be mayor because he defeated the dragon. Like, those are the inferences we make from this, but we never actually hear anything like that in this story. We just project that onto it, right? Yeah. So I think that it's more about the what you are saying rather than how many you're saying, because I could add multiple lines here between these to like further flesh out Torg, but will that actually thicken up towards the character of Torg all that much?
I get it, and it's a bit of a hairy issue, because if you know this very well-known story example of the ad for the children's shoes. You know which one I mean? The ad it's very short. It's kind of like one of these super short stories.
For sale, children's shoes never worn.
Exactly.
Yes.
And the thing is that as a human, you get the underlying tragic story behind that. But can an AI do that? Like, can an AI like take that and run? That's something I find quite fascinating.
Oh, so you mean on the interpretation end, if you feed that into an AI.
Exactly. I'm thinking about kind of these stanzas.
So that's a slide I took out, but a slide that maybe I should have kept in. I think we're overdoing it, a lot of AI research. So if GPT-3, for example, it's this really cool. For those you who have been living under a rock and aren't aware, it's this really cool thing that can generate text that looks almost human-like. It can do a pretty good.
Yeah, they have been playing around. They have been playing around with it in one of the workshops.
Oh, they have. Excellent.
Yeah.
So it generates really interesting, but it's still like subtly, we can tell that a human didn't write this, right? It's really impressive from an AI. Like if you're aware of how AI works, how complicated this is to do, it's super impressive. If I were to hand that to my mother, who is completely unaware of artificial intelligence and the complexities of generating text, she would go, well, this is kind of a bad text.
Yeah.
Right. So I think to a large extent, I mean, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do the GPT-3 project, right? That's obviously something that we should pursue and try to achieve, even though it's dangerous for other reasons in terms of fake news and all that. But I think that where we're at right now and what is accessible to game developers, especially smaller indie developers, we maybe don't want to use technologies like that because they're very difficult to control. They're very difficult to design for, essentially, right? I saw a demo on Reddit yesterday, the day before, where actually did something interesting with GPT-3. He took GPT-3 and a speech synthesizer and used that to create hubbub, basically just general conversation in a marketplace. I think that is where GPT-3 would be really useful. That type of technology would be really useful right now. The thing is that we're hunting mosquitoes with field artillery at this point, right? to use another Swedish idiom, because this is a very powerful system, and relegating it to like, you're going to make some dialogue for our marketplace, right? That's using a lot of resources to achieve not a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. No. Yeah. I see that it's 5 o'clock. Our time has run out. We have been very timely. It's been an honor to have you here again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. If we would have been in the lecture hall, we would have been doing a big applaud, but instead we can, push our little reaction buttons.
Thank you.
So big applaud, button.